All right, so let's move on to a discussion of the Terraform resources in this configuration. So we'll start with the, I guess, the network resources, which are all here in networks.tf. So let me collapse this locals first, and we'll just talk about the resources themselves. So here on line 103 is where we create our application virtual network. And you can see here how we're configuring the DNS server. We add two IP addresses for DNS servers. The first is our private DNS server that is running on ADDS1 VM in VNet Shared. And the second is the special IP address for Azure DNS. So that's how this VNet will resolve DNS queries. Couple of output variables so that I have dependencies on that application virtual network in other configurations. So we're including them in the state file so we can go back and use them to drive automation and other configurations. Here is where we create all of our subnets, and we're looping through some local variables to create those subnets. And we have probably a tricky Terraform technique here called dynamic. It's a dynamic block, and I only include that block if service delegation is required for the subnet. So I test the value of a variable. If it's not null, I then include this content in the subnet definition. So that's a very useful and powerful Terraform feature, dynamic blocks. I output all of my subnets, after they've been provisioned because I use those subnets in other configurations. And then I create a network security group for each subnet. I associate those network security groups with those subnets. And then I create a bunch of network security rules and assign them to the appropriate network security groups. Here's where we set up peering with VNet Shared. So peering is kind of like has to be enabled on both sides. So this is where we enable the peering from VNet Shared to VNet App. And this is where we enable the peering from VNet App to VNet Shared. Then I create all of my private DNS zones, again, using some local variables. And I output a list of those to an output variable because I use them in other configurations. And here's where I link those private DNS zones to each virtual network that's included in my configuration. Theoretically, you should only have to link them to one and peering should pick it up, but sometimes tools in Azure want to see the private DNS zone linked to the current virtual network that you're working with. I know that's true for MySQL flexible server. So basically, I just link them up to every VNet in my peered VNet configuration, which is two: VNet Shared with the shared services VNet, and VNet App, which is our application virtual network. Right, so that's a quick code walkthrough of, well, I didn't show you how I do the locals. It's a similar approach to what I used in VNet Shared. So I create a subnets variable and I populate that with, some objects for each of my subnets. So there's a application subnet, a database subnet, a MySQL subnet, and a private link subnet. And then for each of those, I define which NSG rules I want bound to the NSG associated with that subnet. Okay. And you can see that these two subnets do not use service delegation. However, the one that we use for MySQL does use service delegation. So here I'm defining the service that I'm delegating that subnet to, which is my SQL Flexible Server. Then I create another set of objects for each of my NSG rules, which I can then refer to in my subnet definitions. And then I create finally a flattened group of each subnet, each NSG rule for each subnet. And that's what I reference when I actually create the rules. So it's a lot of code, but it does make it winds up being less code because I can just loop through things using for each to create these things instead of having a separate resource for each subnet. Okay. All right. So that's the network resources. I think I covered most of those.